Hi, I'm Scott Starratt with Starratt Wealth Management, a part of Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. So for today's interview, we're quite happy to have Greg Valliere here. And Greg is quite an interesting person compared to the people we normally have on this little chat. Greg joined AGF Investments in 2019 as the Chief U.S. Policy Strategist. In this role, he's really responsible for providing insights into how the U.S. politics are shaping the global markets. He spent over 40 years following Washington issues for institutional and retail investors, and he's widely quoted in the U.S. media, specializing covering the Federal Reserve, tax and spending issues, and politics. Greg is out of Washington, D.C., where he shares that today, we're doing this in March, that it's a whopping 22 degrees Celsius there. So now the politicians have really a reason to come back to Washington, where they can enjoy the nice weather as well as get some things done.
Right.
Thanks, Greg, for joining us. Let's get right to it. I mean, as I said in the intro, you've been covering Washington for quite some time. How has it changed since you started covering it over the years?
Well, quite a bit, Scott, and great to be with you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this. The changes have been really remarkable. When I came to Washington as a young man to go to college here, it was a collegial town to a certain degree. And as I began my career, I noted that many politicians like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would get together and have a drink at the end of the day, and they'd tell jokes, and people got along. Now there's this very poisonous atmosphere that we've had for the last few years. Perhaps Joe Biden, who's a pretty low-key guy, may change the environment, but it's awfully hard, even if you get along personally with people, it's awfully hard to get agreement on issues. And that's because I think partly of the enormous influence now of political action committees, lobbyists, the internet, where everybody is militant, staking out a position, not wanting to compromise. So this aversion to compromise has really been a big difference.
So if and just to take off on that, so if, for example, there were two senior politicians from a Democrat Party and the Republicans sitting having a drink now, and like you said, with the internet and the lobbyists and stuff, do you even think that would be seen as positive? Like, it's almost as if it would be almost a negative thing for it to happen.
It might be viewed as traitorous by people in their own party. And you raise a really good point, Scott, and that is, now we're in a situation where if anyone is bold enough to say, I'm a centrist, I'm going to compromise with the other party, those people get ostracized in their own party because that is not considered the way to play. So you see, for example, on the huge stimulus bills, the COVID bills, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes, you see on that a lot of the votes were like 100-0, or there was no defections whatsoever in either party. And if anyone did defect, they would be viewed with great suspicion. Frankly, I find that discouraging. In all the years that I've been doing this, I try to be a moderate. I try to see things pretty much in the middle of the road. But now in Congress, if you do that, you get grief from your own party.
Mm, mm. And I mean, not to diminish your role at all, because obviously Washington is a very important, city and environment for really the whole world. But how much does Washington really, or the U.S. government in general, the federal government, really have to do with the U.S. economy? I mean, one of the things you hear is, well, all these, whether it be a COVID bill and, all the money printing and all this stuff that's been going on for the last 10 years, how much does it really affect the average person in Oklahoma or the average person in Illinois?
It's a fair question, and I'd be the first to concede that sometimes the economy just works on cycles like high tide, low tide. You get inflation, then you get deflation. I get that. But I would say, Scott, there are two big factors that Washington has imposed upon the country. The first, obviously, is the Federal Reserve. I think that Jerome Powell the chairman has undergone an experiment on the economy. He is determined to grow the money supply aggressively. He's determined to keep the Fed funds rate close to zero, and he's made it clear that the federal funds rate will be close to zero for at least another 2 years. And during that period, the Fed will be buying enormous amounts of treasuries, mortgage-backed securities to keep interest rates low. So that's the first thing. I think the Federal Reserve, you have to concede, has an enormous role. The second is on fiscal policy. We're at the beginnings of still another experiment. After this horrible year of COVID-19, the politicians have narrowly approved a stunning stimulus bill, 1.9 trillion. That's on top of 900 billion that we did at the beginning of January, and another 3 trillion we did last spring. So we're talking about just staggering amounts of money. And in this latest bill, passed entirely by Democrats, I think you have a left-wing experiment. If some of you are familiar with the modern monetary theory, which holds that deficits don't matter, by the way, I don't believe in that, but for now, that modern monetary theory seemingly has become dominant. And because of that, we're seeing spending on a level that we've never seen before. And this experiment coming out of Washington, I think will determine where interest rates are headed, and especially they'll determine where inflation is headed as we rise our budget deficit by an astonishing total.
So go back to the Fed just for a second, because one
Yeah.
of the things, in your experience is, you've been watching the Fed for quite a few years. And, I'd be interested to know, now, and you say Powell, but there's been various chair people before him. How has that role changed? Like for me, when I first started, and I've been doing this almost 30 years. So when I first started, you very rarely heard from the Fed chairman or chairperson. Really it was something done in the back rooms, and they created this rate and didn't really mean a whole bunch. But now it's almost as if the Fed has become the fourth level of government in some ways. And yeah, some of that's crisis, but some of it is, that just having press conferences, watching what they say, having their meetings that they get asked to speak at, and things like that. Have you noticed a shift in how the Fed operates?
Well, they're a lot more transparent, and for good and bad. There's been an outcry in the old days with Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker that they were not transparent, that they did act behind closed doors, and we would all breathlessly wait for the minutes. Every 6 or 7 weeks there would be the minutes of the past meeting to figure out what they were really thinking. Now, even a junior Fed governor who's only been on the job for a year or so has speeches around the country, makes proclamations on financial television. So you see now the Fed, I think, is probably overdone the transparency in telling people where they want to head. But there's a mood in the country, especially after the Great Recession, it was called about 20 years ago, that the Fed has to be more clear in telling people where things are headed. And that's just the way it is now. I think Jerome Powell is a consensus builder. I think that Janet Yellen, who's now the Treasury Secretary, and before that, Ben Bernanke, all basically were singing from the same choir book. They all were singing from the book of the Fed seeking full employment, seeking low inflation. And now I think they've decided, because of the pandemic, to embark on this grand experiment to they keep saying, we want to go big. We want this package to go really big. They are looking for a hot economy. They would like to see more inflation. The idea that a Paul Volcker would have said, I'd like more inflation, as you know, Scott, that would have been ridiculous. Now you've got a Fed chairman who is openly proclaiming that he would like to see more inflation. And my saying is, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, because as you know, some people might not know, Paul Volcker was the Fed chairman at the time when the interest rates in 82, especially hitting Alberta, because at the same time we had the national energy program kicking in. So you had a double whammy, but that's when we saw these interest rates of 18% for mortgages, and people had to walk away from their homes. And it was essentially to quell the inflation that occurred in the late 70s.
And you have to ask the question, Scott, could we be setting up for a repeat? I mean, nothing ever repeats exactly the same, but the old saying is sometimes history doesn't repeat, but it can rhyme. And this may rhyme with the period that brought about Paul Volcker's stringent policies. I think that by the end of this decade, with a much, much higher debt servicing costs because of deficits, with a Fed that has welcomed inflation, we could be looking at a totally different environment. For now, I think we're good. I think that Powell will create enough money to be able to service the debt. But these things don't last forever.
Right, right. So do you think, based on that's one of the biggest structural concerns for the US market going forward, or are there other concerns that you would have from a structural standpoint?
Yes, I'd say the biggest structural concern you have to say for the markets looking out and for the next few years is the enormity of our budget deficit. In this fiscal year, which started on October 1, we'll probably come in at over 3 trillion. In the year before that, we came in at 3.1 trillion, and no one seems to mind. The feeling is that we can service it with low interest rates. Again, assuming the premise that interest rates will actually stay low. But I think the markets are going to have to worry, not just because of deficit spending, which is extraordinary right now, but because we're all getting older. There's a demographic story as well for Social Security, for pensions, for Medicare. These things will be horribly expensive later in the decade. And I think when you add up the demographic factor with this desire now to spend money in an extraordinary manner, yes, I think the markets at some point are going to have to worry. Where? I think they'll have to worry with interest rate yields. The Treasury 10-year bond yield, as you know, has climbed quite a bit just in the last several weeks. We've got a bond yield at over 1.50. I wouldn't be shocked at all, and my friends at AGF wouldn't be shocked to see the Treasury 10-year yield get to 2% by the end of the year. We can live with that, but it's the direction that I think will eventually become a concern.
Hmm. It's always the rate of change that's the
Exactly.
concern. I joke with clients lots, especially the more engineering type, to remember back to your calculus, and
Mhm.
it's that rate of change that we always talked about in derivatives or integrals, that is the important thing. I mean, the absolute number, like you said, even today, 1.5% is quite reasonable, but going from zero point 0.6 to 1.5 in less than a year, that's a pretty big increase.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I mean, obviously spending, have you spent all your life in the United States? Do you ever
Oh,
work in
yes.
Canada?
Now I do, and I love Canada. My grandfather uh, was born outside of Montreal. I have a French name, obviously,
Mm.
and I love the country. I love every part of your country, from Vancouver to Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful country. I've worked in Washington all of my life, and I've come to like Washington. Most of my friends are here. It can make you a bit cynical. You see the way politicians behave and you shake your head and incredulity, but it's fun. I enjoy it, but I love your country as well.
So what do you say, when someone from the US talks to you about Canada? How would you describe Canada and what it means to people in the US?
Well, first of all, there's the physical beauty. Then there's the fact that most all of you are very nice people. The Canadians are very polite and lovely to get along with. But we do have some policy differences. Let me just spend a minute on that, if I
Mhm.
might, Scott. First of all, there are differences on energy. Obviously, you've got Joe Biden, who I think will get along with Trudeau on a personal standpoint. But Joe Biden, in his first week in office, killed the Keystone Pipeline without giving Trudeau much of a heads up, in my opinion. Biden withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate re-entered the Paris Climate Accord, my apologies, and announced that the U.S. would not have any new energy drilled on U.S. land or U.S. waters. That's quite a difference. I think our two countries are very different. I think that Biden is part of a team that has deep antipathy for fossil fuels, for oil, coal, natural gas. He obviously has an affinity for wind, solar, things like that. So I think that there's going to be differences on that point. You know, there may be other differences on trade, whether it's on lumber or dairy products. There's always been the occasional U.S. Canada dust up. But I think from the standpoint of just getting along, I think Trudeau and Biden will certainly get along a heck of a lot better than Trudeau got along with Donald Trump, to say the least.
So going back to that, to the energy side, when you listen to the, other people, the lobbyists or even the representatives or senators, when they talk about the energy side of things, and you saw Biden, like you said, make a lot of big changes very fast. Do you think that they have, and you understand where they want to get to? And I think we
Yeah.
all would love to have
Yep.
green power and predictable green power. It's fine to have green
Yep.
power, but you need it to be there when you need it, whether it's hot or cold, to run
Yep.
air conditioning or heat. Do you find that they've given much thought about the in-between period, that 5, 10, 20 years between today, where we're still reliant on fossil fuels, and maybe down the road where we become not reliant at all? Has that ever been discussed? Because it seems to me that they make these decisions and then they forget to realize that there is still a lot of power generation that's needed for example, an electric vehicle. Um, I'm rambling here, but if you know what I mean
Oh,
with that, yeah.
you make great sense. And there have been recent examples that would point to this lack of a thorough plan lasting for this transition period. And I would point to what happened in Texas a month ago, in Houston and in Dallas and other cities, where they weren't ready for what they had. Now, that was a once in a 20 or 30-year occasion, but these things do happen. I think most Americans do believe something very odd is going on with the climate. I wouldn't call it global warming. I call it climate change. There's been a lot of radical changes in much of the country. But at the same time, we don't have gas stations that are ubiquitous around the country that have plugs where you can plug in your electric car. I mean, these things are going to come more slowly. Now, the Biden administration is going to propose later this year a $2 trillion green energy infrastructure bill. This, mind you, is on top of the 1.9 trillion that we're about to get for the pandemic relief. So this $2 trillion green program, which will last for 10 years. So it's a mere 200 billion a year, not 2 trillion a year. But I think that'll make a big difference. They have a lot of work to do for energy retrofitting to make buildings in the US energy efficient, and especially to accommodate cars that within a decade and a half will probably be almost entirely electric. You just can't snap your fingers and have a transition like this occur. It's going to take a lot of money and a lot of patience.
Okay. I'm going to put you on the spot here with your crystal ball. And
Okay.
if you were to look at, the end of Biden's first term, the assumption is he doesn't run again, but he might, who knows,
Yep.
right? Doesn't really matter. But where do you think that the Canada-US relationship will be at the end of those 4 years?
Oh, I think it'll be fine. I think that it's important to remember that in a Biden administration, his vice president went to school in Montreal. Kamala Harris, her mother was a professor and a researcher at McGill, and Kamala Harris went to school in Montreal. She has very fond memories of Canada. She could very well be the next president. Joe Biden, between us, I think sometimes he looks frail. Joe Biden is 78 years old. I would be shocked if he sought a second term. So Kamala Harris would be in the mix. And I think she has great affinity for Canada. As far as the Republicans, yeah, there might be a little more friction on trade issues. But I think everyone has been so badly burned by the issue of huge tariffs that Donald Trump imposed. We still have some of his tariffs on China, where U.S. relations aren't great right now. I think he's about to loosen up on tariffs with Western Europe. But I think that the idea that we can achieve much through tariffs has been discredited right now. And I think that's a very good story for U.S.-Canadian relations.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Greg, for all your time. That was really interesting. It's always great to talk to you. I quite enjoy. I know this interview is more general, but I quite enjoy getting into the weeds with you. You're very, very knowledgeable and have a lot of friends and presumably non-friends in the political world down there. But want to thank you very much for coming on and doing this for us.
Well, I hope to do it again. I always enjoy talking to you, and maybe in the spring when we're up to 25 degrees Celsius, we can do this again.
That sounds good. Well, thank you very much, like I said, and thank you for watching. Starratt Wealth Management is very happy to sit down with you and talk to you about the ideas of Greg or some of his other colleagues at AGF, or quite frankly, any of the investment managers that we do use. Please feel free to reach out to us at www.starrattwealth.com. Thank you.